She has made a career out of highlighting the hidden histories that are all around us in books like Vancouver Exposed and Cold Case BC, to her latest title, which is perhaps her most ambitious work to date. Still regarded as the worst peacetime disaster in Canadian history, the May 1914 sinking of the Empress of Ireland in the mouth of the St. Lawrence River claimed more lives than the Titanic and the Lusitania. It is far less well known. One of the reasons, as she puts it, is that it's a Canadian story, and as Canadians, we like to bury the lead. Here to talk about Beneath Dark Waters, the legacy of the Empress of Ireland shipwreck, is Eve Lazarus. Welcome.
Hi, John.
Let's start with why you wrote the book. You write, well, the Titanic was filled with big names from the New York Social Register. The Empress of Ireland was a comfortable workhorse filled with ordinary Canadians. Is that what drew you to this story, the sort of unsung aspect of it?
Partly, yeah, but I guess I'd never heard of it. And when I first heard of it, will be November this year, I was really shocked that, everyone knows about, I think any 12-year-old kid could tell you about the Titanic, but ask them about the Empress of Ireland, which is such an incredible Canadian story, and no one knows about it. And at first I thought, oh, maybe it's an Eastern Canada story. And then when I started doing the research, I found that it affected 8 provinces in Canada, from every town from Victoria to St. John's, Newfoundland, had people that were on the Empress that night. And I guess what surprised me, well, it didn't surprise me that most of the passengers came from Toronto, but the city with the next most passengers was Vancouver. Like 39 people were registered out of booked out, sorry, 39 people were booked out of Vancouver that night. 5 came back. And just about every town in BC had passengers that were lost on the Empress that night. And yet it's just disappeared into history.
Now, part of it, as you point out, is that he was a victim of bad timing because 2 months after it sank, there was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, which then brought about World War I, and then the story of the sinking was largely forgotten for many years.
Yeah, that's definitely right. It was when it happened, of course, there were huge headlines all around the world. And then World War One started 3 months later, and there were horrible devastation and destruction. So I guess it just, 1,000 people dying wasn't that huge anymore with everything else that was going on.
Now, if I'm correct, you first encountered this story because you were asked to fact check one of the more sensational stories associated with the Empress, and that was Gordon Charles Davidson. I'll let you tell the story, but what happened here? What's the sensational claim made about Gordon Charles Davidson?
Well, for I guess in the last 100 and so years, it was always written about that Gordon had swum to shore. He'd survived by swimming the 4 miles, 6.5 kilometers to shore. And it's been written about in books and magazines, and even in Gordon's own obituary and memorial service in the 20s. And Hugh Verrier is a lawyer in New York, and he's from Montreal, and he has a summer property just outside Rimouski, and he swims in the St. Lawrence most summers. And he got a bit obsessed with this story, because he thought if that was true, wow, what an incredible human feat that this man could survive by, swimming to shore. And he interviewed divers and marine biologists and a polarized swimmer and anyone he could think of. And everyone said, no, no, it wasn't possible at all, not at that time of year, not in that freezing cold water and pitch dark. It was in the middle of the night. It just wasn't possible. But he wanted to make sure. So he hired me to see if I could find the origin story, Gordon's origin story. And that became quite an adventure because Gordon died in the 20s. He was a history prof at UBC, but he didn't have any family at all or any children. But he did have a brother who was the head of the physics department at UBC, and he had 3 children. So I built this family tree and ended up finding the brother's granddaughter in Spain, and she had the origin story. And it turned out that Gordon didn't swim to shore, but it was fascinating. His survival story was absolutely fascinating. And we ended up tracking it to this tiny little newspaper in his hometown in Union, Ontario. Uh, but that got me wondering how many other stories were wrong and why were they wrong? How did this sort of myth be carried on for a century? And so I sort of went down the rabbit hole and decided to look at more of the survivors, more of the stories. And about 5 years ago, Hugh had organised a Zodiac to take us out to the St. Lawrence River where the wreck is. So the wreck's still there. And it was quite a powerful experience, just knowing that you're hovering over this underwater graveyard. There's still over 800 people were trapped inside and they couldn't get them out. And that was incredibly, incredibly powerful for me. And that's, I guess, at that moment, I decided I really wanted to write a book. And the way that I could see myself through the book was by writing about the Canadian survivors and following their lives and impact.
Now, let's talk about the sinking itself. The Storstad, it's a Norwegian coal vessel, hits the Empress dead center under heavy fog, leaving this huge gaping hole. In about 30 seconds, the Empress takes on almost half her own weight in water. Not an easy question to ask, but who is at fault here?
Yeah, and that's still under debate. It was a clear, bright night. The Storstad was coming from Sydney to Montreal with coal. The Empress was going out to Liverpool. At that time, ships needed a pilot to help them navigate through the tricky St. Lawrence River. So the Empress was going in to drop the mail and her pilot off at Point-au-Pair. And they knew that the collier was coming in to pick up a pilot. But there was tons of room. The St. Lawrence is 50 kilometres wide at its widest point. It's a huge river. So two ships, big deal. They could see each other. They just made note. And then as they got really quite close, fog just descended and completely blanketed them in. And if they both stayed on course, they would have been fine. But they didn't. It seems like both corrected course and it put them into the worst possible place. The collier had an ice prow and it managed to hit the Empress right, as you said, right in the worst possible place between the watertight doors. And where normally it should have been able to float, water, it was just catastrophic. Water just, suddenly came in. Lights went out all of a sudden. The ship started to list. And what I still find hard to get my head around, from the time the Storstad hit the Empress to the time that it sank was 14 minutes. So these people in the middle of the night who were asleep in their bunks had 14 minutes to get out, get in the water. And I guess the worst thing that happened, because it was 2 years after the Titanic, so they had a full contingent of lifeboats, of lifebelts, of, saving materials. And the ship had listed so quickly that they could only get 4 of the lifeboats out. Now, the Storstad couldn't come too close because of all the people in the water, but it managed to get, I think, 4 or 5 lifeboats out. It was only a small ship of 35 people, so they weren't equipped to do a life-saving operation of this magnitude. There were over 1,000 people. 1,500, I think, on board with crew and passengers. But they did what they could, and they managed to get a number of passengers onto the Storstad and warmed up. But yeah, it's amazing to me when I look at that, think anyone survived. As it happened, only 220 of the passengers survived. So only about 1 in 5.
Now, there are so many characters in this book, so many interwoven stories. The figure that sticks out to me, though, is that of Captain Henry George Kendall. The line from him, "There's only one thing I'm sorry for, and is that they did not let me drown." How much of this can be laid at his feet?
He was found not to be guilty by the CPR and found to be guilty by the Norwegians. And when it went to whatever the main court is, they still found that the Norwegians were at fault, but very reluctantly. I think it was both. Both captains played a part in this. It was a really horrible, unfortunate accident. And I think what happened with Captain Kendall, he was a rising star, 39 years old, and had a terrific track record. He was very charming, was very good looking. The passengers loved him. He was benched straight away, put on to desk duty in Amsterdam. So I think that was pretty telling from the CPR. And whereas the captain and his um, second in command, who was actually in command of the ship and the Storstad, were just put back to work. So it did show where the companies, I guess, were thinking.
Was Captain Kendall cursed?
Captain Kendall was not cursed. That was one of my favorite myths. Because 4 years before, he was on another ship, the Montrose, when Dr. Crippen murdered his wife and escaped with his lover to the States. You can't make this stuff up, can you? And I can't seem to find a story that doesn't have a murder. That's the first chapter of the book. But Captain Kendall was a bit of a true crime fan, and all these posters were going up in Antwerp where he was taking off and coming to Canada on the sailing. And he, looked at these pictures and I thought he recognized the passengers. Dr. Crippen was dressed up, and his 25-year-old lover was dressed as his son, 16-year-old boy. And Captain Kendall thought that looked a bit strange and had them for dinner at the captain's table and all of that. And this was in the days where Marconi Wireless was very new, and this was one of the first ships that had it on board. And Captain Kendall thought, well, I've got to be sure because this could be a career killer, if I identify the wrong people. So in the end, he decided he was right, and he telegrammed the CPR and said, Crippen and his girlfriend are on board. And then he was out of range. So he had no idea if they got the message or what happened. But Scotland Yard got the message, jumped on another ship that was much faster, and went across. And in real time, all these newspapers are following this adventure, across the Atlantic in real time. Kendall has no idea. Crippen doesn't know he's been caught. And they get outside Rimouski and he's arrested. And supposedly Crippen says, "Curse you, Captain Kendall." And then 4 years later, the Empress sinks. So great story, goes all around the world. And then I'm in the Salvation Army archives in Toronto a couple of years ago, going through letters. And Kendall had written to the Salvation Army, who lost a huge contingent of people that night on board. They're very, very connected to the tragedy. And here's Kendall's letter saying, oh, no, that never happened. And I've got the letter in the book. So that was great to bust that myth. Great story, though.
Now, as mentioned, the Empress of Ireland is basically forgotten about in the wider world for about 50 years. It's only about the 50th anniversary in 1964 when divers finally discover the wreckage.
Yeah. Yeah, 50th anniversary stories went out in a few of the papers, and these divers sort of thought, oh, well, let's see if we can find it. How cool will that be? And they did. They found it. And then decades and decades went past of pillaging as just about everything was brought up that they could find or sell. And they put a stop to that in the end of the 90s. And now there's this little buoy that's got a heritage designation when you get out right on top of it that says you cannot bring anything up anymore. I'm a bit conflicted about that because on the other side, a lot of the things that have been brought up have been donated to museums. And there's a fabulous museum at Pointe-à-Pierre that's just devoted to the Empress of Ireland. And that was a terrific research source. And also just to look at some of the artifacts that were on the ship at that time. It was quite a gorgeous ship.
Is it a case that whatever could be saved has been by now?
No, there's still a lot down there apparently, and it's very dangerous to get down there. I think 7 divers have died trying. It's not very deep, but the water is very cold, the visibility is difficult, tides change really quickly, and so you have to be a very experienced diver. And even then, you've only got a certain amount of time. You still have to I think you've got probably a maximum 45 minutes to an hour down there, and then you have to come and decompress. So every 10 minutes you have to wait, and 10 minutes after that. And people have been stuck in there and run out of air. And So a lot of the, and that's really why the bodies are still in there. It was just too dangerous to bring them out.
What do you think the legacy of the Empress of Ireland is? You mentioned, for instance, the Salvation Army and how this was the single most important event that shaped the history of the Salvation Army in Canada, for example.
Yeah, 161 Salvation Army people were on board that night. They were going to an international congress, and the entire Salvation Army band was on there. And they were incredibly brave. When I read about their acts of heroism that they did, they were giving up their life belts, they were stopping to help people, and a lot of them died because of that. So they lost most of the contingent of Salvation Army people, including the top brass. And so it's something that the Salvation Army have never forgot. When you go to the town of Rimouski, they've never forgot either. This was a small French Canadian town of 3,000 people, and they just pulled out all the stops to help survivors and take on the dead and put them in temporary morgues and get the people into private homes and get them, to Quebec City to hospitals and stuff like that. And we went back for the 111th anniversary last year and took a bus tour, and streets are named after the Empress. And there's a real connection to it there, apart from the museum. A lot of the people are buried there, a lot of them are unidentified. There are two graves, of course, one for the Catholics, one for the non. And we stopped, and the Salvation Army did memorial service there for the dead. And it was quite powerful, really special.
Another fact that you point out in the book that struck me is that a million or so Canadians from coast to coast can trace their roots back to an ancestor who came to the country on this ship. You call it Canada's Mayflower.
Yeah, isn't that wild? That really stunned me. And I haven't been able to substantiate that number. It came out on the 100th through the government had put that out that 120, the Empress brought 120,000 people, mostly out to Canada, mostly immigrants between 1906 and 1914. So they've kind of extrapolated that and said, okay, well, that would be about a million people today. And if that's true, that's one in 40 of us. And when you think of our multicultural makeup, I mean, that's staggering to me that we have such a strong connection, and Western Canada has such a strong connection. I'd love us to know more about it. I'd love for, a 15-year-old schoolboy to be learning about the Empress of Ireland and not the Titanic, uh, or both.
Or both. What do you hope people get out of the book?
Just to know how important that this was to Canada and continues to be. Even a couple of years ago, some historians from Quebec found a film in an auction in London, and it had on this 10-second film there were pictures of the survivors from Silverton, BC. A man there had saved one of three children out of the 139 children aboard. Only three lived, and one of the one of the children was from Silverton. So that was amazing to me that we're still finding things. We're still finding ephemera and film, and the story continues.
Indeed, it does. The name of the book is Beneath Dark Waters, The Legacy of the Empress of Ireland Shipwreck. It's published by Arsenal Pulp Press. My thanks to author Eve Lazarus.
Thanks, John.